and more come up, finish, settled at this stage? How do you see this apartment cycle?
What was your name?
Betty.
Hey, Betty. It is just a supply and demand dynamic at the end of the day, and I think Brisbane has a very well known oversupply at the moment, and we're seeing that in the price growth. And Dr. Wilson, I agree with his point about you will see that flush out of the market. So it just depends on, and I'm not an expert on the amount of supply that we have in the Brisbane market at the moment in apartments. That's not my space. So Dr. Wilson may have another opinion on it. But this was something that certainly was on my radar for a long time before it occurred. And it was out there in the financial press and in other places that there was a lot of supply coming online in Brisbane. Some of the commentators, like the ones I mentioned before, were talking about it years out from the date. So what's going to happen next in the Brisbane apartment space will depend on how much supply there is, and it will depend, I think, also, like any market, on what the overall economy is doing around that. So I do see that we're primed for... Look, when you have an event like, say, a GFC type event, what you see is everything falls. It doesn't matter. And the way the supply and demand dynamic plays into that is you have less money around. So you shrink a market you shrink world markets by 50%, the supply of money dries up, people just have less money to pay for things. And it tends to be the top end that suffers the most for that. The bottom end, there's something of a flaw there. And so the bottom end of the market doesn't tend to lose as much as the top. And that's all I can really say to you. There could certainly be a collection of factors which means that the market doesn't rebound. But I'll probably hand this one to Dr. Wilson because he seems better informed than I am on the specifics of the Brisbane market.
Well, look, it's an interesting question, of course. And I think that there's something that's become a bit of a hobby horse of mine. And I think the biggest restriction we have to development, which always used to be local factors such as not in my backyard, particularly for higher density, is now shifting across, and perhaps I should have put this into the question about the Royal Commission, is about what we're seeing is perhaps questionable restrictions on development finance. And a lot of big developers in Sydney and Melbourne are now really pulling their hair out of their heads because they can't get development finance. I think we've got to start having a very serious conversation about, I guess, the modelling that banks do in terms of their decision making on where they decide to allocate finance for development. I think we've got to take that, process of evaluation away from the finance provider and put it into a more of a neutral sphere, which does look at the realism of or the reality of underlying supply and demand dynamics, because banks tend to be more risk averse perhaps in certain conditions than they should be, and we are certainly seeing a soaking up of apartment developments in Melbourne and Sydney at the moment, and the roadblocks for more development aren't necessarily the legislative roadblocks in terms of planning, but they're actually getting the money to do the development because banks won't lend, even with significant pre-sales. And I think that there is a growing, trend or conversation happening about taking away that power that banks have for providing development finance, without having some realistic assessments.
I was going to say, with the panel's permission, I wouldn't mind weighing in on that one myself. So I think you've got a set of unique dynamics. So first of all, in 2014 in July, we had a new city plan come out. And when that comes in, it comes in with a projected 20-year growth pattern. And so all of the developers go, fantastic, we've just been rezoned, let's build that 20 years worth of capacity right now. Would that be a fair assessment? And then what happens is everyone goes and gets their DA approvals done, thinking that they can make $1 squillion, and then commercial reality sets in, and there's an oversupply of approvals, but not necessarily the actual construction of product. And that's because the dynamics of people actually buying dictate whether or not developers can afford to build. So yes, there's an oversupply of approvals, but whether or not there's an oversupply of actual product is probably a different question.
That's very true, Rob. So just very quickly, so of every application that's approved by council, it's only about 50% of all applications actually have a commencement. So, but certainly, can I just say, at the top end, and I noticed there was a question from Ironfish earlier, I know your clients as Area Property Group, for example, they at the top end of the unit market, the resales have been very, very strong. They've been recording something like 20, 30, 40% improvements in price on resale. So at the quality end, it's been extremely good. But you know, I mean, again, any oversupply that might be mooted out there is quickly being absorbed. The market will slow down if there is oversupply, and it'll catch up very, very quickly. So the worst thing that people can do in these situations is to panic sell. It does pay to hold until that market gets stronger again.
Yeah, so that's basically my point. Is anyone at the moment suggesting that the apartment market in Brisbane doesn't have its issues?
Yeah, I don't think it has any issues. I think it's great.
I know.
I think the only issue is fear, and it's just, look, as I said,
well, could I put a bit more around that question?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I put my hand up.
I appreciate that, and I'm just interested. No, I do. Yeah. I did, and I'm interested in how you have that view, because I have clients right now who are trying to sell apartments that they bought a little while ago and taking a bath on them.
Well, maybe they're asking too much.
No, they're selling it under what they bought them for.
Well, that's their opinion, isn't it? I mean, the market rules.
No, it's a fact. They're selling for less than what they paid for it.
Well, we're talking about an aggregated market here, where we're talking about the total of the marketplace.
So just to be clear, you don't think that there's anyone out there in Brisbane right now who's bought an apartment in recent times that's currently selling at significantly less?
I never said that. Of course not.
That's my question.
No, I'm just saying there's no oversupply. I mean, supply, in a sense, the word oversupply in regard to apartment markets is a misnomer for a start, because you never have supply match demand in real terms. Because whenever you perceive demand...
As moderator, can I interject this healthy debate? I'm going to propose that perhaps there's an alternative view where perhaps you're both right, and it's the kind of product. And maybe the kind of product which is investor stock may be struggling, the kind of product that is, I guess, owner-occupier might be doing well, and maybe there's a slight difference. And overall, how does that weigh out? It's probably a question for yourself,
Yeah,
Andrew.
But there are individual circumstances. We can't talk about a market as a whole and then describe individual buyers and sellers' circumstances, because we're not really coming to any sort of outcome. So it's the aggregated market that makes sense. I mean, market dynamics are a factor of all the built-up buying and selling decisions that are made at the ground level. Then we come to a top-end view. I mean, that's the nature of the housing market, and that's why, in a sense, there is no Brisbane apartment market. It's all about all those individual little buying and selling market decisions that are made. But there's no doubt that if we look at the measures that we can use as a total, that those are all now looking for demand catching up with supply. But you never have demand and supply matching in real time. If that happened, you know what, we'd all be developers, because there'd be no risk. I mean, developers, it's about risk and return. Developers have to pitch their product to a forward position of demand. They take the risk, they make the money. Some of them make money, some of them don't. It depends on the cycle, it depends on their own abilities. At the moment, there's no doubt that after a record period of apartment market development in Brisbane, the back end has fallen away, demand is rising, and it's soaking up the market. So those developers, those buyers and sellers that have come in perhaps at the bottom of the cycle, are obviously in a position where they're not reaping the rewards perhaps that they wanted to. But it's a long-term game anyway, is it not? I mean, as I said, the median house unit price in Brisbane at the moment is just under $300,000. I would be flabbergasted in a year's time if you could get a one-bedroom apartment in Brisbane new for $300,000. So maybe it's a good time to buy.
Well, there's two sides.
Maybe they should be buying and not selling.
Unfortunately, gentlemen, we are actually out of time, and clearly that was a fantastic question, so thank you very much for that. For the audience, I'd like you to thank our four panel. So the Brisbane Lord Mayor, Dr. Andrew Wilson, Michael Corianos and Russell Sparks. So thank you very much. If anyone would like a photo, we'll happily come to the front of the stand for 30 seconds and pause for your enjoyment.
Thank you, Rob, and all the panelists. Let's give them another round of applause for such a great insight into the market.